One night when I was about 15, I was home alone for the evening. I lived in an older 2-story house, and I often felt uncomfortable being there by myself at night, especially in my room, since it had the door to our creepy attic. Since I was so uncomfortable upstairs, I spent the evening watching TV downstairs, adequately distracted from being by myself. At some point, I decided I was ready for bed, and went upstairs to my room. I shared a room and bunk bed with my older brother, but he usually got home late, if at all, and went to bed way after me. Our bed was pushed into the corner of the room against the wall. The bottom bunk was mine. I was pretty tired, so I laid down and fell asleep almost immediately. Shortly after that, I woke up to my brother slapping against the wall by sticking his arm through the gap between the side of the bed and the wall. It's dark, and I can clearly make out his arm smacking against the wall. Annoyed, I tell him to stop, and then roll over and try to go back to sleep. Of course, he keeps slapping the wall, but harder now. I'm getting angry, so I tell him if he doesn't stop, I'm going to hit him. Unsurprisingly, he doesn't listen and starts slapping the wall even harder. At this point, I'm done with his shenanigans, and I roll over to punch him in the arm. Instead of hitting him, I just hit the wall. A little freaked out that he pulled his arm away so quickly, I get out of bed and rip his covers off to reveal no one there. This scared the hell out of me, and with nowhere else to go, I went downstairs and turned the TV way up and spent the rest of the evening frightened and alone. This happened to me a few years ago. I live near a lake, more of a pond, really. Right up the road is a small hill that leads to a hiking trail. I know this trail like the back of my hand, and one night I decided to go on a hike. It just got done snowing, and there was a full moon, and like that Disney princess, the cold never really bothered me anyway, but it was a little slippery going up the hill. The trail was a little buried under the snow, but it's a full circle, and it's impossible to get lost. I get going, and I finally made it to the part of the trail where it's covered in trees. But being wintertime, it more resembles bony hands reaching towards the heavens. This is when I saw it. I saw a silver light shining in the distance. The way it moved, I assumed it was some trash caught in a tree. But the closer I got, the more it seemed to take shape. I was about 500 to 600 feet away when I saw that it was a woman. She was in a silver dress, a real fancy-looking one. It's definitely not something anyone would wear in this weather. As I got closer, I could see that she looked like she was crying. I assumed she was lost or in some type of danger. I began to walk closer to her, and as I did, she began to walk towards the lake. It's a pretty steep drop-off to the lake from where she was. I began to run after her to see if I could help, but by the time I reached where she would have been, there was nothing and no one around. I look all around and even climbed down to where she would have fallen, but nothing. Not even prints in the snow, except for mine. By the time it dawned on me, there was no trace of her even being there. I heard a scream like nothing I ever heard before. And I look up to see the woman just walking on the water. It may have snowed, but it definitely was not cold enough for the lake to freeze. I stood there, frozen in fear, as it dawned on me of what I was seeing. She let out one more scream before sinking under the lake. I hightailed it back to the trail and back to my home in record time. I'm not even sure what I've just seen was real. I've never gone back at night hiking, and even now, I never go alone in the day. I'm a service tech who gets into a lot of homes, businesses, and abandoned warehouses. 20 years ago, I had a work order for a local residence to service their water softener. I entered the home, met with the missus, and headed for the basement, where the equipment was located. As I worked, I could hear the mister working in his workshop a few doors away. He was cheery. I could tell from his pleasant tune that he whistled over and over. I finished up about 25 minutes later and wrote up the billing invoice, and at that, I walked over to the woodshop to explain it to him. When I approached the door to the shop, all noises stopped. I peeked my head inside the room. It was empty and dark. The saws and equipment neatly stowed with little evidence that they had been used recently. I could have sworn, but maybe he must have gone upstairs when I was working. So I proceeded to deliver the slip upstairs to the missus. I mentioned to her that I was going to explain the repair to her hubby, but he had left his shop before I could see him. It was at that point that nearly all the color drained from her face and distress obviously appeared. I kept hearing that tune that he whistled in my head, and I blew a few phrases so she could hear. She began to tear up and told me that her husband had passed away suddenly a few weeks back. The tune I whistled was so familiar to her, as he had whistled it over many years, but especially when he was woodworking in his shop. As I left, I couldn't help thinking about how the spirit must have been watching over his living wife, and I wasn't fearful. Nice, huh? When I was little, my family lived in a 2-room apartment with 2 bathrooms, one in the master bedroom and one in the hallway, a kitchen, and a living room. There was also a balcony that had these long, flexible, sliding blinds that hang down vertically from their track. My bedroom was just across from the guest hallway bathroom. My parents' room was at the end of the hallway, and on the other end of the kitchen, which was on the right-hand side facing towards the master bedroom. On the left side, there was a small space for a table, and behind the table was the sliding balcony door. The living room occupied the rest of the space. I spent the first 3 years of my life in that apartment, and during the time, my parents claimed to have witnessed things moving on their own, things that they would put down on the center of tables rolling or sliding off, or the vertical blinds falling off the track without any kind of influence. The most chilling thing from that time that my parents have both told me was that I had an imaginary friend who I named Elmo. Elmo was extremely tall enough that his back would be against the wall, and he was all red. According to my dad, I would often talk to myself. When asked who I was talking to, I would reply, stating that I was talking to my imaginary friend. When things were put in the wrong places, I'd say that Elmo did it. If things fell off the table, Elmo did it. If the TV was left on at night, Elmo did it. Despite these creepy occurrences, nobody really batted an eye until the same year we left that apartment. I remember having very vivid nightmares and sleep paralysis episodes at a very young age. And I had a distinct fear of the bathroom across the hall from my room. My little brother would also refuse to use that bathroom alone, even in the daytime. Our guess is he saw something in there much like I had in my own room at the same age. By the end of that year, my parents had decided it was best for us to move. My father even admitted to having the home blessed before we moved out, which is saying a lot, since he normally was not superstitious or a paranormal believer. He holds the same belief I do, where we don't believe in the paranormal unless it shows itself to us. The fact that my father felt that he needed to have the apartment blessed before we moved out really makes me wonder, was there influence to that decision? But I digress. Now that the major context is out of the way, here's the part that came up recently. I was babysitting my youngest brother at my grandma's house. My dad is a single parent now, and he often needs breaks from watching my youngest brother to take important meeting calls. So either myself or my grandma will take over that role. At the time, he was either 4 or 5. He's on the autism spectrum, and as a result, especially back then, he had a hard time communicating in full sentences. He still was, and is, able to get his points across with somewhat fuller sentences, but at this time, he would only say 1 or 2 words at most. This particular day, I was entirely home alone watching him until my grandma got back to take over. Normally, one of my aunts would be there, but this particular day, it was just my brother and I. At some point, he got very upset and began trying to block off the hallway that my grandma's bathroom was in. Her hallway closet and pantry door both open outward, and you can cover the hallway with the doors. At first, I tried to get him away from the doors and move him to the living room, which was closer to the front door so I could investigate. I got my knife from my bag and had him wait in the living room as I went to see what would have scared him. I checked every inch of the bathroom, all 3 bedrooms in that hallway, the closets, the bathroom and the master bedroom, everything. I couldn't figure out what spooked him. Despite not finding anything remotely threatening as I searched, I just felt really uneasy. That could, of course, be written off as paranoia due to the situation of me, a teenaged girl, alone in a house with a boy who's getting scared about something in a dim hallway with 4 rooms and 2 closets. But the feeling was eerie, nonetheless. When my grandma got home, I of course asked if my brother had done this before when she was watching him, and to my surprise, she said yes. She told me that he's been getting scared and saying there was a monster in his room at night. She also brought up how he was the same age as my other brother and I were when we saw, who I suspect was the imaginary friend, Elmo, and reminded me that my grandpa, who was a religious leader of sorts in her church, was the one who blessed the apartment before we moved. Later on, I brought up this experience to my dad, who also agreed the situation was similar to what happened when we lived in the apartment all those years ago. He also told me that my mom had seen a tall figure as well throughout her life and my childhood. However, we wrote that off since she has been on substances for the majority of the time I've been alive. Either way, I find the whole situation just incredibly unnerving, regardless if it's some kind of spirit or just some kind of hallucination my whole family seems to be prone to seeing. My grandmother was Wiccan and could hear, see, and sense things, and that was passed down to me and one of my cousins. I've seen, heard, and experienced a lot of things, but nothing really bad, until my mom had gotten a little doll from Africa that she kept on top of her entertainment center. I had bad vibes from that doll from day one, and I told my mom a few times that she should get rid of it. But being the extreme realist that she is, she always said it was just a doll. She liked it, and it was directly from Africa, and it was staying where it was. It was initially just a sense of unease, but that feeling grew stronger to where you could feel the hate and malevolence this doll was giving out. It came to a head one evening when I was over visiting. The doll sat in the center of the unit, looking out over the living room. My mom was at the far end of the living room, and I was in the kitchen getting a drink, when she went silent in the middle of her sentence. I came back in to see her standing and staring at the doll. It was no longer in the center, but was now at the edge and had turned 90 degrees and appeared to be staring at my mom with such fierce hatred that even my mom could feel it. She got as far as, "What?" when the doll fell from the entertainment unit and onto the floor. My mom let out a small shriek while I grabbed a sheet and threw it over the doll and called my grandma to let her know what happened. She said she would be right over and to wait outside until she got there. Even getting to the front door was a challenge, as this thing was draining the energy from the room and we were getting weaker until we got outside and things were a little better. My grandma got there about 10 minutes later, and I followed her into the house. My grandmother was a sweet little English lady with a sweet disposition and never had a bad word about anyone. She walked into the living room and with a strong voice that I had never heard from her before, said, "All right, that's enough." She walked over, lifted up the sheet, grabbed the doll, and put it in a small beige bag she was carrying with her. She walked over to my mom and, reverting back to the sweet little old English lady, said, "Don't worry, dear, I'll cleanse the doll and you won't have to worry about it anymore." Then she got back in her van and drove off. My mom was still a little freaked and spent the night at my place, as there was no way she was staying at her house that night. I went back to my grandparents' house about a week later. My grandma went up to the attic and came back down with the doll. My mom shrank back, but my grandma handed the doll to me. I took it, and I felt absolutely nothing. Whatever she had done to the doll worked. My mom tentatively took it and relaxed. It's back at my mom's house now, but not on the entertainment center. It's on a bookshelf in a well-lighted corner of the living room.